Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
How to survive camping. If you could leave a 5-star review, I'd appreciate it right now. By Bonnie Quinn. I run a private campground, and let me tell you, it's a more stressful job than it seems. Between the casual murder committed by my former bestie Beau, deal with it, shippers, and the recent slew of 2-star reviews from folks that don't understand that I can't control the weather, it's enough to drive anyone to order IHOP pancakes for dinner like a trash human being. If you're like, wow, that's very specific, Kate. Yes, it is very specific. Except my town is too small for any delivery service to be in range. So I ordered it to my brother's house and showed up on his doorstep to collect it. Like, don't ask questions, and left with my bag of shame in hand. If you're new here, you should really start at the beginning. There's a playlist below, along with other very helpful links. I wasn't very good about responding to the comments in my last post. I got behind and then just stayed behind. But I did notice that a handful of you had thought on the origin of the shepherd and what the branch he carries is. I looked up the suggestions, and it is a cypress branch. This is why it's helpful to have a diverse group when you're trying to find solutions to a problem. You never know where a good idea will come from. Unfortunately, that's about the only thing I was able to verify. I haven't seen the shepherd since our last encounter, which I suppose isn't necessarily a bad thing. He only shows up when the frost is literally trying to drag me into an icy grave, or when I'm mourning someone's death. I could do without both of those. But just because I haven't seen the shepherd doesn't mean he still hasn't had the effect on my campground. Catalysts are unexpected things. The inhuman world is in many ways a mirror of our own, and we find symbolism in everything from storms to an oddly shaped rock. We find significance in innocuous objects and actions. A kind word from a stranger in a grocery store may trigger an emotional breakthrough. A teacup sitting on a shelf may bring back memories of a long-lost relative. A padlock left locked on a fence symbolizes your devotion. In stories, the big ones, the catalyst is often something huge and important, a magical sword or a prophecy fulfilled. But the little stories, the ones about the creatures around us every day, those are the small, subtle things. Those are the catalysts we're more likely to encounter. A bit of food shared with a stranger, a glance at someone you perhaps should have passed by with no notice, a stone perched precariously on another stone that you chanced to touch. I think my act of looking at the shepherd was a catalyst. The frost has altered itself. I do not think that the shepherd was the cause of it. Beau has described a web before, in which I thrash, blind to the consequences. My simple act of looking at the shepherd may have been a catalyst that shifted something in my land, and now I'm left with the results. And the results are bad. A slew of 1- and 2-star reviews never looks good for a business. Fortunately, we don't have anything big happening in the middle of this week. We have campers every day now, as people are taking summer vacations, but the numbers are manageable. I shudder to think of what would happen had this occurred during one of our big events. I've said many times before that I'm an early riser. I like to make a lap around the campground while other people are still waking up with their hangovers to make sure nothing unfortunate happened overnight. Plus, it's hard to sleep through the little girl being dragged away by the beast. so I tend to wake up at dawn anyway. Normally I enjoy some coffee first, but this time I decided to make it go. It was ready by the time I finished hastily dressing, so I poured it into a thermos and hurried to fetch my four-wheeler from the garage. I needed to get a look at my campground as soon as I could, because when I woke, I found that my windows were completely frosted over. In June, with weather that's routinely in the 80s. My garage rattled open, and I stared in horror at what lay beyond. A thin sheet of ice covered my driveway, as if it had sleeted overnight. The grass was similarly iced over. I looked at the forest, dreading what I would see. I expected trees bent over from the weight of the ice, branches broken off, utter carnage that would take so much money and years to repair. But the trees were clear. Their leaves rippled gently in the early morning breeze, and the ground glittered like it was littered with diamonds in the glowing sunlight. I carefully eased the four-wheeler out onto the ice. Fortunately, I've experienced driving on ice. I try not to, but sometimes a campground needs something done in the winter, and of course there's groceries to be gotten, and our snow removal system around here is only slightly better than wait for spring. Let me tell you, going slow and careful is way more stressful when you're in a hurry. I needed to know how the overnight campers on site had fared. I can't say that I was starting to relax by the time I got through most of the campgrounds, but at least my white knuckles were mostly because of the ice on the road at that point. The campsites I checked were all okay. I found one site that had a few early risers, and I briefly stopped to speak with them. No, nothing odd had happened overnight. They'd slept through this freak ice storm, they said. No temperature drop. The ice hadn't even stuck to their tents or anything else they'd brought. Just the ground. One of them asked if this was why Rule 15 existed, and while I was grateful that someone had read the pamphlet, I mumbled, yeah, sure, it was something like that, and then drove off before they could ask more questions. I didn't want to tell them that there was no freak ice storms in the area and the ice was coming up out of the ground. I wanted to make sure everyone is okay, and then drove around, keeping an eye on people, in paranoid anxiety until the ice melted. I reasoned that it had to melt at some point, right? And if it didn't, I suppose I could invite over that one slightly related aunt that tries to chat up my staff for gossip when they visit the town hardware store, and then murder her to summon the shepherd. I was keeping that idea as Plan D. If you're like, wow, Kate, that's pretty high on the list for something that involves murder, maybe you haven't changed that much. Look, there was no Plan E. I just didn't have a lot of good ideas to deal with the situation. Plan A was literally drive around and hope for the best. I only made a couple laps of the upper parts of the campground before Plan A failed spectacularly. As I was coming up to the hill that led to the deep woods, I heard some alarming noises coming from further in the forest. There weren't any campers in the deep woods. I didn't explicitly forbid people from camping down there at this time of the year, but I discourage it with mundane reasons. Water hookups are farther apart, it tends to flood when it rains, less accessible by road, so you have to haul your stuff farther, harder to find clear areas to set up tents. When there's a lot of shaded, lovely camping spots further uphill, no one finds any reason to keep going. I hastily radioed the staff that were already on site and told them to take over for me in the patrolling of the campground. I warned them to use the four-wheelers and leave the golf carts in the shed, even though that meant less people out checking on campers. I don't trust golf carts on ice. Then I got off my four-wheeler and carefully began the walk down the hill into the deep woods. Yes, I went on foot. I had to. There was no way that the four-wheeler was getting down that hill without sliding, and I wasn't confident I would be able to keep it from rolling in the process. As it was, I had to sort of crouch and let myself slide down the hill like I was ice skating. I only stood up once I had come to a stop. The sound was somewhere ahead and to the right of me. I heard the breaking of branches and my heart sank. Maybe the ice had managed to make its way up the trees and they were collapsing under its weight. I resolved to go just as far as I needed to confirm at a distance. That was all that was happening. Falling branches can be incredibly dangerous, after all. It's not really something most people think about, I imagine, until emergency workers are pulling them out from under a tree and their hip is in far too many pieces. Be careful when it's windy or icy is all I'm saying. Anyway, I kept going at a careful pace towards the source of the sound. It grew louder and I realized I was nearing it much faster than I had anticipated. Nervously, I stopped and listened, peering through the trees. The sunlight reflected off the ice on the ground and blinded me, turning everything in front of me into a glittering blur. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing. Something was moving, and the sound of breaking branches was growing louder. It was coming towards me. I hastily turned around and began heading back up the road towards the hill, leading out of the deep woods. The frost was responsible. This was all I needed to know. I didn't really need to see for myself what was happening. I walked as quickly as I dare, not looking behind me. I could tell I was still being followed by the sound of snapping branches alone. I didn't need to risk a fall by looking away from the ground directly in front of me. I couldn't afford a busted wrist or worse, a busted ankle right now. So I kept going, heart pounding, step by step on treacherous terrain. And all the while the sound of something pursuing me grew louder. The branches were being ripped violently from the trees and the canopy shook as if in a storm. My mind played images of the horse-eater, a desiccated, rotting body with a single glowing eye pursuing me through the frozen forest in search of revenge. I resolutely shoved them aside. I had to stay calm. It didn't mean I wasn't afraid, but I couldn't let that overtake me. I had to keep moving ahead. I risked a backwards glance when I reached the hill. I finally needed to know what was pursuing me. It would be easier to get up the hill if I veered into the forest because I could find purchase in the soft earth. But I'd risk being directly under the largest branches if I went off the road. If I stayed on the road, I would be significantly slower. I had to choose which risk to take. So I looked. It was a tornado. Not a big one, not like we see in movies. The top of it extended no further than the canopy, and it was about as wide as a car. But still, it was a tornado in my forest. At first, I thought it was carrying a mass of broken branches in its body. It was hard to see because instead of dirt, it was ripping up ice from the ground. It shone like a disco ball, a riot of crystalline shards catching the light like little stars. Then I realized the color was off. It wasn't a muddy brown-gray. It was paler. And then a hand reached out of the whirlwind, grabbed hold of a nearby tree branch, and snapped it clean off before discarding it to the ground. A pale hand, coated with a lattice of frost. Those weren't branches it was carrying. It was bodies. And we thought the urine balls were bad. I hastily veered off the road and into the dirt. I needed all the speed I could muster to get away from this thing. I caught another glimpse in the edge of my vision as I scrambled sideways towards the forest. More hands were stretching out of the glittering whirlwind, and the crack of branches echoed through the woods as the frozen fingers closed on nearby trees. A face peered out at me before being whirled away, mouth agape, eyes blank. Then I was clawing my way forwards, scrambling up the hill on all fours. The frozen ground was harder to break through than I had anticipated. My feet slipped as I sought to punch my heels through the layers of ice. My fingers slid futilely on the surface, so I grabbed at the trees instead, pulling my body along, lunging for the next tree when it wasn't within reach. I made it halfway before I slipped. I fell, landing on my side, and began to slide backwards. I flailed about in panic, trying to roll myself over, spreading my arms and legs out in an attempt to gain some traction. The terrain sloped down towards the road, so that was the direction I fell, and I knew I had to stop myself before I reached it, before it turned into a flat surface of packed earth, covered by a sheet of ice with no handholds to save myself with. I snagged a sapling just as my body spun slowly onto the surface of the road. My heart pounded in my chest while the sapling bent under my weight. Tentatively, I brought one foot up underneath me. Another. Something grabbed me from behind. Hands closed on either arm and lifted me up. I admit, I screamed, flailed a bit too, trying to kick, punch, or bite my assailant. I'm glad I didn't succeed in that last one. "Campground manager," a voice said sternly from behind me. "We are not your foes this day." I quieted. I recognized the voice. The harvesters. I glanced around me and saw that no one had me by either arm, and the rest were grouped behind me. I could see the tornado over their heads. It was moving sluggishly towards the bottom of the hill, but we were moving faster than it. The harvesters were having no problems walking on the ice, and they were taking me up the hill with them. I sagged in relief, the adrenaline cooling quickly in my blood and leaving me shaking. "Did you come to rescue me?" "No, we were already on our way out of the deep woods, and you happened to be ahead of us." I glanced behind us. The tornado had veered away from the hill. It was staying in the deep woods. "You're fleeing from it," I said softly. The one to my right nodded slightly in assent. "Is everything getting out of its way?" I continued. Another nod, which meant that all of these inhuman things would be lurking in the rest of the campground. My campers were no longer safe where they were. The harvesters released me at the top of the hill, and I collected myself and then thanked them for their help. They didn't intend to stick around for a longer conversation. They might have helped me in the past. They might actually be useful, but that didn't engender any affection from me. I can like the end result of their actions, but still loathe them for the way they go about it. The harvesters, unfortunately, had business with me before I could leave. "We are concerned," one of them said. "I'm working on the frost situation," I growled. "This just started this morning. Give me a break here." They shook their heads as a group, not in unison, for their hive mind was not absolute, so that put the gesture slightly lower on the creepy scale. Still pretty creepy, though. "That is not for us to interfere with," said another dismissively. "Another has claimed it." Great! So there went any hope of recruiting them for another round of inhuman versus inhuman problem solving. Apparently they were content to let the shepherd fend for himself. I tersely asked them exactly what they were concerned about. I didn't want to hear the answer. It's just when you're faced with a half a dozen or so inhuman things known for casually vivisecting people to piss them off, you go along with whatever it is they want with you. But no, I still get campers that are like, "I tried to punch the creepy scalpel-welding faceless raincoat people, and now I'm down a lung. However did this go wrong?" There is a void in the campground, they said. I about had a damned heart attack, thinking that perhaps fixing the thing in the dark had gone wrong, and now the gray world had formed a supernatural black hole somewhere. But no, they were being figurative, though I'm not sure their explanation was any better. Old land is too attractive a territory for inhuman things. Creatures like them could reside easily on old land, but they were not the type to assume any sort of role of significance. They were lesser creatures, and they said this without a trace of embarrassment or resentment. It simply was what they were, just as gravity is a force we accept as fact. There were greater creatures on this land. Were. The Fomorian, the thing in the dark, all gone now. And what about the beast? I asked. It is occupied with your family line, one replied, and is of no concern to us. Oh, what if it starts taking an interest in the rest of the campground? If that time comes, there will be nothing you can do to assist us. I fell into an uneasy silence after that. I understood their meaning all too well. The beast would only lose interest in my family once we were wiped out. No, they were more concerned about what this void might attract. It was old land, after all, turning ancient, an attractive proposition for any inhuman thing, particularly the more powerful ones that see territory ripe for the taking. My land might attract another Fomorian or something like it. It might attract something worse. My heart sank. Everything I've done so far isn't enough. I've always known that old land attracts creatures, and that sometimes we get things from the outside. Maybe I hoped there would be an end to this someday. That the land would stabilize because I killed everything that needed killing, and I could live in peace until I was old, and felt like it was my time to go. Or maybe I'd be doing this for the rest of my life, fighting every damn day. They left. I stared back down into the deep woods and listened as the cracking of branches grew fainter. The tornado wasn't coming up the hill, but I didn't want to risk having people around until I knew for certain it was constrained to the deep woods. I needed to convince the campers to leave and then shut down for a day or more, which meant issuing refunds. I hate issuing refunds. I told my staff to put the employee with the best customer service voice at the front desk and maybe slip them a bottle of whiskey for when everyone was gone. I'd be responsible for going camp to camp, asking people to leave. At least I had a ready excuse. We're under a tornado watch, I told them. A couple of them checked their phones in confusion. One of them protested that they saw the forecast. The sky was clear after all, they said angrily. And it was clear last night when we got this freak ice storm, I said through clenched teeth. The weather in this area can change dramatically in a very short amount of time. I trust the local forecaster way more than I do some latte-sipping, skinny-jean-wearing nerd that only sees the light of day through the window of their multi-million-dollar daycare for programmers. Turns out they were a programmer themselves, and that's how I got at least one of those one-star reviews, I'm sure. I'm the campground manager. I just feel tired right now. Tired and frustrated. Don't get me wrong, like hell am I going to give up. Maybe I'll have to fight every damn day to keep this campground running. I kind of feel like I've been doing that all along, and I am only now starting to realize how hard the struggle is. I wonder if it wore on my parents. They at least had each other, though. I wonder if that was enough. I wonder about why my mother left that window open. I guess I'm going to have to shove those thoughts aside for now. The frost tornado is staying in the deep woods, but it has forced everything else out. Bo has dropped by, and he is not pleased about this development. I can't really have campers out there when there's a bunch of ticked-off inhumans roaming the area they'd be camping in. So No income until I get this problem fixed. Maybe it isn't healthy, but it's a solution that I'm familiar with. And it's a solution that worked in the past. I'm tired. I'm frustrated. But most of all, I'm angry. I'm angry that the harvesters don't think I'm capable of defending my land. I'm angry that this happened when I felt like I was just starting to make some real progress. And I'm angry that everything I've done so far could be undone if some new creature moves in. It's time to use that anger and punch a stupid corpse tornado right in its stupid frickin' face. Oh, figuratively, of course. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.